Attention, friends. Before you dive into this creepy and fascinating story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like and click the bell to be the first to know about our new scary, mysterious, and mystical stories. Now get ready for the cold of fear to creep into your bones. The darkness was slowly, reluctantly, giving way to the night, which held endless secrets. High above the old monastery rose black towers, shrouded in mist. This place was called the Convent of St. Edmund, and people in the area had long avoided it. Old books claimed that good deeds had once been done here. Nuns helped the poor, treated the sick, and fed the hungry. But over time, something went wrong. Legend had it that the monastic community had become the object of someone's envy and cruel curse, and many believed that Sister Beatrice herself was involved in this, a mysterious woman with a fiery gaze who ended up here for unknown reasons. Our main character is Richard Marlowe, a freelance journalist and documentary filmmaker who decided to make a film about mystical and paranormal phenomena. He received a strange email. The sender was someone named Lucas Gray, who claimed to have learned a terrible secret about a forgotten monastery and the identity of a nun whose thirst for revenge on the living extended even beyond death. The letter contained an invitation to come to a remote mountainous area where the convent of St. Edmund towered. Whether the author of the letter was driven by a sincere concern for historical truth or a desire to lure the uninitiated into a web of nightmare, one could only guess. But Richard loved dangerous stories too much to refuse. After all, stories are his bread and butter, and the feeling of fear and danger only spur the interest of viewers. Lucas Gray suggested meeting at a ruined Gothic cathedral near the monastery. Upon arrival, Richard was struck by the scale of the majestic building, already half captured by nature and time. The stones that once formed graceful arches were now crumbling, and the sculptures, angels and saints, looked with empty eye sockets. The wind seemed to sing its eerie song, flying through the cracks of the stonework. The acquaintance with Lucas was short. He was a short, thin man with uncertain movements, as if he always felt someone's presence behind him. He handed Richard a bundle of documents yellowed by time, among which were letters, notes of nuns, ancient prayer books, and even fragments of diaries eaten away by insects. He briefly told about the mysterious Sister Beatrice, who at first glance seemed pious and meek. However, in the most secret corridors of the monastery, according to Lucas, a trail of dark events, illnesses, and madness stretched behind her. Then Lucas quickly left, promising to contact later. Richard was left alone with the half-abandoned walls and dizzying curiosity. He soon discovered that the documents mentioned the names of other nuns: Sister Magdalena, Sister Alice, Sister Clara. Much of this evidence was devoted to scandalous events, as many novices mysteriously disappeared, and official records tried to hush up the fact under the guise of illness or flight. The documents also mentioned abbots, who then resigned or disappeared without a trace. The name of Sister Beatrice came up everywhere. There were rumors that she had strange abilities. She allegedly read minds, predicted events, and in moments of anger, she could even curse the unfortunate. Was this true, or just the invention of impressionable young nuns? Richard understood that the best answers could only be found on the spot. A desperate journalistic streak called him to go deep into the convent of St. Edmund. He did not immediately succeed in entering the monastery courtyard. The ancient iron gates were captured by rust and entwined with weeds, but he managed to find a loophole and get inside, risking injury on the sharp bars. As Richard stepped onto the creaking stone slabs, the sense of the obvious presence of strangers' gazes lurking in the darkness nearly deprived him of his senses. It seemed as if the nuns who had once walked through this courtyard had never left it, but had merely moved into another reality, that our world sometimes. One of the doors to the main building was slightly open. It was dark inside, but moonlight timidly made its way through the narrow cracks in the windows. The smell of damp, mold, and decay filled the air with a thick, suffocating cloud. The cold penetrated to the bones, although it was a relatively warm season outside. The masonry of the walls, dotted with cracks, reminded of long years of oblivion. Richard decided to explore the corridors. Turning on the flashlight, he noticed long shadows running along the walls. But as soon as he turned the light there, nothing was found. The journalist had an overwhelming feeling that someone invisible, but clearly felt, he unexpectedly came across a massive door with a faded sign, "Library." At one time, church books, manuscripts, and documents were apparently kept here. Judging by the quiet creaking of the door and the clouds of dust, it had been opened many years ago for the last time. Inside, several rows of darkened oak shelves were found, on which in some places folios with rotted spines and half-torn pages still stood. The soft light of the lantern picked out titles in Latin, French, sometimes in German. In the back of the room, a table was visible on which yellowed sheets were scattered, perhaps abandoned since time immemorial. Taking several sheets, Richard began to read. On one of them was written, "Sister Alice's report on the state of Sister Beatrice's soul." It turned out that Sister Alice was worried about Beatrice's frequent trances and the strange words she uttered at night. Alice believed that Beatrice had been involved in dark occult practices for a long time. The nuns had tried to exorcise her filth, but their rituals and prayers had no effect. From the following lines, it could be understood that Abbot Conrad had gotten involved in the matter, calling in a famous exorcist from another abbey. But all the information about this was fragmentary, and the ending of the story remained unclear. Suddenly, Richard heard a strange rustling coming from somewhere in the far corner, as if someone was carefully moving among the shelves. He called out, "Who's there?" But silence was the answer. His heart was pounding in his chest. Adrenaline was hissing in his blood. Common sense said, "Go away before it's too late." But professional passion kept him in place. A book suddenly fell from a high shelf in front of Richard, raising a cloud of dust. The cover was black, untitled. On the flyleaf, in faded ink, was the name Sora Beatrice. It was probably a handwritten edition. The pages concealed a set of incomprehensible symbols written in Latin, as well as mysterious diagrams similar to magic circles. One in particular stood out for its size and the number of drawings. Inside the circle were depicted standing figures of nuns, and in the center was a blurry face. The Latin signature said something about lux in tenebris, light in darkness, and maledictio occulta, secret curse. Richard shivered. For a moment, it seemed to him that the air around him became thicker and colder. Having gathered his courage, he continued his journey along the corridors until he came to a wide hall with columns, a kind of courtyard surrounded by arcades. In the center of the courtyard stood a dried-up fountain, from which emanated melancholy and abandonment. On the edge of the fountain bowl lay an old rosary, wooden beads, worn down by time. Richard picked it up and suddenly felt an inexplicable anxiety stir inside. His head spun, and shadows of female figures dressed in long robes flashed before his eyes. They seemed to be begging for help or mercy. Suddenly, a woman's whisper sounded, "They are doomed. The trap is here." Richard threw the rosary aside with a sharp movement, trying to come to his senses. An insistent crackle of thunder filled the courtyard, although the sky remained clear. At the same moment, the silhouette of a woman in a nun's robe flashed in one of the windows on the second floor, and then disappeared into the darkness. "Who are you?" Richard muttered, knowing that he was unlikely to get an answer. But he decided to check anyway. He climbed the stone stairs, the steps of which creaked treacherously, threatening to collapse. The corridor of the second floor greeted him with an impressive painting on the wall, a depiction of a scene with the Virgin Mary and the baby Jesus. But the corner of the canvas was charred, as if fire had licked it mercilessly. Richard carefully stepped further until he reached a row of doors with carved numbers. Once there were living cells. The first door was locked. The second had no handle. The third gave way under a gentle push. It was dark inside, and in the rare glimmer of the flashlight, Richard saw an old bed, a rickety table, icons on the walls. But all of this seemed to breathe despair. On the table lay a diary in a cloth binding. When Richard opened it, he discovered that the entries were written by Sister Magdalena. She described how Sister Beatrice went into the monastery dungeon at night and returned at dawn, covered in blood. Rumor ascribed to her the ability to heal the terminally ill. One of them, a certain Padre Antonio, rose from his sickbed without a single sign of illness after several hours spent alone with Beatrice. However, almost immediately after this, the healed Padre lost his mind, cursing everyone and everything. He had to be isolated in a hospital cell, where he remained for the rest of his days. Sister Magdalena considered this not a divine miracle, but dangerous dark magic, and claimed that Beatrice worshipped something that had nothing to do with God in her secret rituals. Suddenly, the floorboards in the corridor creaked, and Richard realized that someone was standing very close to the door. He quickly put out the flashlight and pressed himself against the wall. His heart was pounding unbearably. The steps came closer, stopped at the threshold, and through the crack, Richard saw the edge of a black robe. But whether it was a vision or a real woman, he could not understand. A few moments passed, and the figure disappeared. Richard carefully looked out, but the corridor was empty. The thick silence only pressed on his ears, almost driving him crazy. Having gone down to the first floor again, Richard decided to find an exit to the dungeon that Magdalena wrote about. He suspected that it was there that the solution to all the horror that had permeated these ancient walls was kept. Moving along the passage, he saw a staircase leading down. Moonlight fell on it through a half-broken stained glass window, as if ordering him to go there. Footsteps echoed in the damp semi-basement space. The walls were gaping with mold, covered in green mud in places, and the musty smell was becoming more and more unbearable. Soon he came out to a massive iron door with patterns in the form of crosses and strange symbols, reminiscent of the drawings from the book he had found. The lock was torn off, either by time or by someone's hands, and the door gave in with effort. The room behind the door was a crypt. The low ceiling rested on vaults, and stone sarcophagi were located along the walls. The air here was heavy, as if saturated with centuries of sorrow and something even more sinister. In the very corner of the crypt, Richard saw a large stone tombstone with a name carved in Latin: Beatrix de Monte Cristo, Sora Divini Ordenis. The age of the slab exceeded all conceivable time. Richard took a step closer, and at that moment he seemed to hear an eerie groan through the thickness of the stone. Or was it just a draft? Feeling a tingling in the back of his head, he approached and noticed that the edge of the tombstone was raised, as if someone was trying to move the slab from the inside. While Richard was thinking about this, the silhouette of a woman in a nun's robe appeared in the darkness behind him. In surprise, he turned around abruptly and shone a flashlight on her. In the dim light, he made out a sad but beautiful face. Her lips were moving, as if she was trying to say something, but no sound came out. Her eyes reflected unbearable melancholy. Richard wanted to speak, but his breath caught, and a lump rose in his throat. The nun raised her hand and pointed to the tombstone, and then began to disappear, as if dissolving into thin air. At the last moment, she said in a half-whisper, "Free." The words echoed in Richard's mind. He realized that all these souls were bound by some curse that had been placed here long ago. An inexplicable feeling of guilt and compassion arose. After all, it seemed that the souls of the nuns were perhaps in eternal imprisonment because of sins they had not even committed. Perhaps it was all the fault of one single dark heart. Gathering his will into a fist, Richard approached the slab to try to lift it, but the slab was incredibly heavy. Then he noticed an iron crowbar on the floor, probably left here by those who had already tried to open this sarcophagus. Our hero, with difficulty overcoming the resistance of the ancient stone, was able to lift the slab enough to look inside. What he saw made him go cold with horror. There was no skull on the remains, dressed in a rotten nun's robe. In the skeleton's chest lay a bunch of torn rosaries, and in its hand was an unknown relic, resembling a small figure made of dark metal. Its features were vague, but they evoked disgust and devilish fear. Suddenly, the vaults shook. A dull growl was heard, like the gnashing of thousands of demonic throats. Clouds of dark smoke rose around the sarcophagus, and a figure insanely similar to Sister Beatrice, but with a distorted face, appeared right in front of Richard. She bared her black teeth in a bestial grin, and whispered in a whisper that echoed in the walls, "All who disturb my peace are damned. Blood calls blood." Her eyes flashed with a red light. Richard felt his arms and legs seized by paralyzing horror. He could not move. The smoke began to envelop his throat, penetrate his lungs, causing suffocation. It seemed that in the last moment of his life, Richard was seized by a bright flash of panic, and the realization that he would repeat the fate of many who had entered here before. But suddenly, he managed to reach into his pocket, feeling there a small silver cross, a gift from his grandmother. She was deeply religious, and Richard, skeptical of religion, wore it only as a keepsake. But at that moment he felt a warm energy radiating from the cross. He pointed the cross at the demonic image of Sister Beatrice, and not knowing the prayers, simply screamed, "Leave me." A deafening screech rang out, as if from 1,000 torn souls, and the shadow retreated slightly. The clouds of smoke wavered, and Richard, having regained the ability to move, took a few steps back. He understood that the creature had not disappeared completely, but had only weakened for a moment. decisive action was necessary to destroy the source of the curse. Remembering the notes about the dark ritual, which mentioned a curse contained in a magic vessel, he connected this with the mysterious figure in the skeleton's hand. Perhaps it was the core of evil. Instantly deciding, he jumped to the sarcophagus and grabbed the relic. A searing pain shot through his arm, but he clenched his teeth and threw the figurine to the floor with a sharp movement, crushing it with a heavy piece of stone. The cracking of metal merged with the furious scream of Beatrice's enraged ghost. The smoke screen swirled in a mad whirlwind, knocking Richard off his feet, and then everything suddenly fell silent. Only the journalist's heavy breathing and the hollow echo of his own footsteps sounded now in this gloomy crypt. When Richard got outside, the rising sun was already painting the sky with pale pink stripes. The wind walking through the monastery courtyard no longer seemed ominous, and the gray walls were unusually cleared of some eerie aura. He felt the spirit of liberation and quiet sorrow hovering around. Perhaps the souls of the nuns, languishing for centuries under the power of the curse, now found peace. Richard couldn't know for sure, but an unusual feeling of relief, and maybe even a little happiness, settled in his heart. He carefully crossed the courtyard and went out the gate. Lucas Gray was already waiting for him on the road to the ruined Gothic cathedral. Smiling nervously, he asked Richard if he had found out what the secret was. But Richard's look made it clear that he was not ready to talk about it yet. He felt that he still had much to process. They got into the car and drove away, leaving behind the ominous towers that had become silent witnesses to terrible events. That same night, Richard began editing the video footage taken at St. Edmund's Convent, collecting all the information he had found together. He now had enough evidence in his hands to tell the whole world about a lost monastery filled with ghosts of the past, about the terrible fate of Sister Beatrice and her victims, about a curse that could lock souls in darkness. He knew that this story would capture the imagination of even the most sophisticated viewers. The documentary promised to be a real sensation. No special effect could compare with the authentic horror captured by his camera. However, the mystery remained. Why Beatrice? What pushed her onto the path of black magic? A thirst for knowledge that she could not use, or a thirst for revenge for grievances that history has not preserved information about? Oddly enough, Richard did not hate her. Rather, he was characterized by the bitterness of understanding that there are no infallible souls, and even those who dedicated themselves to God can sometimes fall if enough darkness is sown in their hearts. He hoped that by exposing the secret, he helped to find peace not only for the innocent nuns, but also for the unfortunate soul of Beatrice herself, who was probably once sincerely devoted. After his return, Richard began to have increasingly disturbing dreams. Snowy mountains, dark silhouettes of nuns, their solemn chants that ended in a scream. But the next morning, he could not shake the feeling that one of those shadows was still reaching out to him, perhaps with a request, or perhaps with a threat. Now he knew that the monastery walls had seen far more horrors than he had managed to uncover. Evil knows how to hide, wait, and strike when you least expect it. And the story of Sister Beatrice is just one of many dark legends that the past era hides. But no matter what happened, Richard could no longer retreat. After all, the most terrible thing is not the presence of darkness, but our unwillingness to notice it. Rumors of Richard's ominous discovery spread throughout the area. To his surprise, Many locals confirmed that they had long known about the curse of the monastery, but preferred to remain silent, fearing misfortune. Several people passed him old photographs, dating back to the early 20th century, showing groups of nuns in the garden of St. Edmund's convent. In the very center stood a woman with a face that radiated coldness, Sister Beatrice. Her eyes seemed to look straight into the soul, and even in black and white, her presence seemed frighteningly alive, repulsive, and at the same time attractive. Richard decided that his film should end with a call to understand all these events. The question is not only whether mysticism is real, but also how deep are the roots of evil that can arise in the very heart of a holy place. Can a simple human heart become the soil for ancient otherworldly forces if there is enough despair or rage in it? Everyone will find the answers for themselves. But one way or another, the unknown must be studied, even if it frightens and burns, because only the light of knowledge can help to overcome the thickest darkness. Richard still had a long way to go, editing the footage, working on the script, coordinating with the local authorities, who would clearly not be thrilled with the fuss raised. But he knew that the truth deserved to be known. The shadows of the past will not disappear if you close your eyes to them. He intended to go further, to uncover new secrets that would send shivers down the spines of peaceful citizens. In the meantime, he had in his hands a whole story about a cursed nun, whose shadows touched him, and perhaps forever changed his soul. He could not say whether he had become more courageous, or, on the contrary, more cautious. But the feeling that someone was watching closely from the semi-darkness did not leave him since then. Some inner voice whispered that he must return to the convent of St. Edmund and perform the rite of consecration. Otherwise, evil could be reborn. But is one person strong enough to resist it? Yes, he had destroyed the material vessel of the curse. However, the essence of the dark force itself could be looking for a new form and a way back into our world. It remained to be hoped that the calmed souls of the nuns and the prayers of the entire monastery became a reliable shield from the revival of horror. Life had taught Richard that some doors are dangerous to open because they can no longer be closed. Perhaps he will have to fight his nightmares and the annoying memories of Sister Beatrice's embittered face for a long. Now he was just beginning to understand. A collision with the otherworldly changes a person forever, revealing the abyss that was hidden behind the usual reality. It is impossible to return to ordinary life with the feeling that everything is as before. No, now he will live with the awareness that mystical forces exist that cannot always be explained within the framework of logic. And somewhere deep inside his mind, there will remain the thought, is there not a particle of evil left in me? After all, when he used his own silver cross, he felt not only light, but also something strange, as if the darkness was trying to hold him back, whispering that this was only the beginning of the path. The shots that Richard was preparing for editing reflected the cold corridors of the monastery, ghostly silhouettes, fluttering cassocks, empty cells, libraries covered in dust, and fleeting shadows eluding the camera. No special effects could so convincingly convey the atmosphere of frozen time, saturated with the silent screams of dozens of unfortunate souls. Let many doubt the reality of what they saw, but the finished film will be documentary evidence that there are things that we are unable to fully understand. And it is not about faith, not about the scientific approach, but about the very nature of the world, which has always kept many secrets. Several weeks passed. Richard contacted several producers to whom he told about his material. One of them, Oliver Denton, showed particular interest. He proposed to take on a large project about the history of old European monasteries, in which, according to rumors, similar mystical cases occurred. Richard thought, and how many more of them are there, such forgotten convents, full of ghosts and curses? He felt both fear and delight. After all, new horizons of investigation were opening up ahead. But for the first time in his life, he was afraid that he would encounter even darker entities than Sister Beatrice. It is possible that many monasteries across Europe and the world hide secrets that can shake faith in the safety of reality. One way or another, Richard decided to continue on his way. He had seen too much to give up now. His film about the story of Sister Beatrice and the convent of St. Edmund became the beginning of a whole series of reports under the general title Seals of Darkness. It will take the viewer through eerie places filled with the groans of long-departed victims and the whispers of those who yearn to return from beyond the grave. And the first story is the curse of a nun who was able to connect her bitterness and hatred with forces far beyond human. In the evening, rereading old notes, Richard caught himself thinking that a strange feeling of cold arose in his chest every time he recalled that fiery gaze and heartbreaking cry of Sister Beatrice in the crypt. However, it was too late to regret that he had once set foot in those ancient walls. The spiral of events had whirled him around, and perhaps he would never be the same again. But somewhere deep inside, there remained a sincere desire to help those who wandered like ghosts among the ruins of their past, finding no peace. Richard understood that people wanted to hear not just stories, but to see evidence, and he had notes, including moments when the camera seemed to focus on a shadow by itself, drawing an almost elusive outline of a monk's figure. The microphone caught a strange echo of voices that were barely distinguishable, but when the volume was increased, they sounded like a choir. He was sure that many skeptics would suspect editing and forgery, but only those who had been there themselves would understand how much horror and truth these recordings conceal. In the end, everyone chooses what to believe. But it is no longer in Richard's hands to convince people. He showed what he saw and felt with every fiber of his soul. A strong knowledge settled in his heart. Sister Beatrice will not stop tormenting this world until the evil that was born in her heart is finally banished. But perhaps now the damned soul no longer has enough strength to break through to the living. Or maybe, before dying, Beatrice repented of what she did, and her ghost is only looking for a way to earn forgiveness. Life is life. It does not stop at such mysteries. But what we call reality often intersects with foggy realms full of mysteries, superstitions, and truths that are hard to believe. The monasteries, castles, and cathedrals of the last century are perfect examples of this. How many legends are buried in dusty books and forgotten crypts? How many demons and spirits have we ourselves released when we stopped believing in evil and ignored its signs? These questions troubled Richard, because now he knew that some of the answers were hidden not in religious dogma or scientific theory, but in the fine line between life and death, which is so easy to violate if you delve into the story of Sister Beatrice, and the cursed convention of St. Edmund is but a drop in the ocean of secrets hidden in the shadows of centuries. But it shows how fragile our notions of virtue and divine protection are. Even within holy walls, something terrible can take up residence if darkness takes root in someone's soul. And then no one is safe from its corrupting influence, neither the righteous nor the wicked. Richard put the last period on the draft of the script and looked up at the screen. There was a frozen frame of a woman in a black robe, her head bowed. Her face was out of focus, but her eyes glowed in the darkness. Suffering? Threat? Both? He touched the screen with his fingertips, as if trying to touch the very soul of this ghost. Then he stood slowly, turned off the light, and walked past the mirror. For a moment, he thought there was someone else in the reflection besides him. But when he looked again, he was alone. Yes, he was alone, and he must tell people this terrible story so that no one would remain in the dark. After all, evil thrives where there is no light of truth. This is where our story about the nun from the convent of St. Edmund comes to an end. If you were intrigued, shocked, or scared, support our channel. Like, subscribe, and click the bell so you don't miss new, dark, mystical, and scary stories. And the darkness, it is always near, and who knows what secret we will reveal next time. Take care of yourself.